Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel, a place where curious minds can rest and drift gently into the mysteries of the past. Tonight, our journey takes us into the vast and shadowed story of the Second World War. Imagine the world in the mid-20th century, skies filled with the hum of aircraft, oceans alive with fleets that stretch to the horizon, cities wrapped in silence beneath the glow of blackout curtains, and voices carried by radio, bringing both comfort and resolve to millions waiting in uncertainty. For 6 long years, the war touched nearly every nation, reshaping borders, shifting lives, and leaving behind stories both tragic and extraordinary. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into history, I invite you to like and subscribe, or share one of your favorite facts down in the comments. But for now, settle back, let the weight of the years drift away, and allow the past to carry you softly toward rest. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The Second World War stands apart from all others in scale and sorrow. Spanning from 1939 to 1945, it drew in more than 60 nations and touched nearly every corner of the globe. The human toll was immense. Tens of millions of soldiers, and even more civilians, lost their lives. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and countless families were forever altered. Unlike wars of earlier centuries, this conflict reached into the skies with bombers, across oceans with fleets, and into factories where every rivet and every loaf of bread became part of the struggle. Its shadows still stretch into our present, shaping the modern world in ways both visible and unseen. To drift into its story is to step into history's most sobering reminder of how vast human conflict can become, and how deeply its echoes continue to linger. The war spanned every continent and ocean. Few conflicts in human memory ever reached as far as World War II. From the frozen Arctic convoys to the sands of North Africa, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Normandy, the war played out across landscapes as varied as the Earth itself. Merchant ships carried supplies through perilous waters, while submarines lurked in the deep. Soldiers marched beneath desert suns, while others endured winters so cold they seemed to freeze time itself. For the first time, technology allowed war to cross oceans quickly, turning the globe into a single battlefield. Even nations far from the front lines felt the weight of rationing, shortages, and the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. To look back is to see a planet transformed. Every shore touched, every sea crossed, every sky alive with the movements of a world caught in conflict. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park helped shorten the war. Behind the quiet gates of Bletchley Park in England, a secret war was fought with pencil, paper, and machines that were the ancestors of today's computers. Here, mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers worked day and night to unravel the encrypted messages of Germany's Enigma machine. Among them was Alan Turing, whose brilliance helped crack codes that once seemed unbreakable. These breakthroughs gave the Allies glimpses into enemy plans, rerouted convoys, and saved countless lives. Yet the work was cloaked in silence. Those who labored there often never spoke of it, even to their families, for decades after the war. Only later would the world learn how much was owed to these quiet minds in country houses filled with clattering machines and chalkboards scrawled with symbols. Their contribution was one of patience, intellect, and persistence. A reminder that wars are not only won on battlefields, but in the whispers of hidden rooms. The Manhattan Project secretly built the first atomic bombs. In laboratories scattered across the United States, Britain, and Canada, a secret project took shape. One so vast and hidden that even many who worked on it did not know the full scope. Known as the Manhattan Project, it gathered thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers to unlock the power hidden inside the atom. Towns appeared almost overnight, built around guarded laboratories in places like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. The effort was unprecedented, blending science, industry, and secrecy on a scale the world had never seen. By 1945, the project had achieved what once seemed impossible: the creation of the first nuclear weapons. Their use would end the war, but also open a new and uneasy chapter in human history, the dawn of the atomic age. It is a story of ingenuity and consequence, of shadows that extend far beyond the war itself. Entire cities were moved underground to survive bombing. In many places, survival meant seeking shelter beneath the earth. Londoners took refuge in the tunnels of the underground, transforming platforms into temporary villages of mattresses, blankets, and whispered conversations. In other cities, basements, caves, and bunkers became homes away from home, where families cooked, slept, and tried to carry on as best they could. In Germany, vast underground factories were carved from rock, moving industry away from prying aircraft overhead. Children played by candlelight, and neighbors formed small communities beneath streets that echoed with distant thunder. These hidden cities became symbols of resilience, life continuing even under the heaviest of shadows. When people emerged after the air raids, blinking in the daylight, they carried with them both relief and sorrow, and the unshakable memory of nights when the safest place in the world was beneath the very ground they walked upon. Women took over entire industries, while men went to war. With millions of men drawn into battle, factories, farms, and offices across the world faced shortages of hands. Women stepped forward to fill the gap, entering industries that had long been closed to them. They riveted steel plates onto aircraft, assembled munitions, drove buses, tilled fields, and even worked as mechanics and welders. Posters celebrated their contribution, the most famous being Rosie the Riveter, symbol of strength with rolled-up sleeves. Yet beyond the slogans was real labor, exhausting and often dangerous. Many women balanced these demanding roles with caring for children and maintaining households. The war reshaped ideas of what women could do, leaving behind a legacy of empowerment and change that extended far beyond 1945. For many, it was the first time their work had been recognized as essential to a nation's survival, a quiet but enduring revolution born in the shadow of war. The war saw the first use of computers in history. During the war, the need to process information faster than ever before led to one of history's great innovations: the birth of computers. Machines like the British Colossus and the American ENIAC were built to perform calculations at speeds no human could match. At Bletchley Park, Colossus helped crack coded messages, while ENIAC was designed to calculate artillery trajectories. Though massive, humming with vacuum tubes and miles of wiring, these early machines marked the first steps into the digital world. Few could have imagined that these room-sized devices would one day shrink into tools carried in our pockets. Yet their origin lies in a time of urgency, secrecy, and necessity. In the quiet of their blinking lights and spinning tape reels, the future of technology was quietly awakening, a legacy that would outlast the war by decades, shaping the modern age in ways no one foresaw. Millions of prisoners of war were taken across the globe. Captured soldiers became part of the war's hidden population. Prisoners moved across borders and oceans, confined in camps ranging from crude barbed wire enclosures to sprawling compounds. Conditions varied greatly. Some prisoners found themselves forced into labor, while others endured harsh treatment or deprivation. Yet amid hardship, human connections persisted. Secret schools were formed, plays and concerts were staged, and friendships grew across national lines. Letters from home were treasured like jewels, read and reread, until the paper wore thin. For many, captivity stretched into years, with the world outside reduced to rumor. Liberation, when it finally came, was both joyous and disorienting, as those who had been hidden away stepped once more into a world transformed. Their stories remind us of the war's quieter struggles, battles not of weapons but of endurance, patience, and the will to hold on until peace returned. The Holocaust claimed 6 million Jewish lives. Among the darkest shadows of the war was the Holocaust, the systematic persecution and murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, along with millions of others targeted by Nazi ideology. It unfolded not in sudden violence alone, but through years of laws, ghettos, deportations, and camps built for extermination. Entire communities that had flourished for centuries were erased. Survivors carried memories too heavy to put into words, yet many bore witness so that the world would remember. The Holocaust remains a central truth of the war, a warning of what happens when hatred is left unchecked and when humanity turns against itself. To speak of it softly is not to diminish it, but to hold space for remembrance, to honor those lost and ensure that even in quiet retellings, their voices are not silenced. It is a fact that forever shapes our understanding of history and of ourselves. The United Nations was born directly from the war. Out of the ashes of the Second World War came an idea to create a body where nations could gather, speak, and resolve differences without returning to battlefields. In 1945, representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco to draft the Charter of the United Nations. Its goals were ambitious: to prevent future wars, promote human rights, and foster cooperation across the globe. Though imperfect and often challenged, the UN became one of the enduring legacies of the war, a reminder that from conflict can come attempts at peace. The very name United Nations had been used during the war itself to describe the Allies. Now, it became a vision for the future. For those living through the aftermath, the creation of the UN symbolized a fragile but hopeful step toward a world where dialogue might take the place of devastation. The war truly began with the invasion of Poland. On the first day of September 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border, unleashing a storm that would spread across the world. The invasion was swift and relentless, with tanks rolling across fields and aircraft darkening the skies. Poland resisted bravely, but it faced the might of one of the most modern armies in Europe. Within weeks, the Soviet Union attacked from the east, dividing the nation under a secret pact with Germany. The fall of Poland shocked the world, making clear that Hitler's ambitions would not be contained by diplomacy. For Britain and France, it was the final line. 2 days later, they declared war. The invasion marked the true beginning of the Second World War, a moment when the fragile peace of the interwar years shattered, and the world entered a conflict that would reshape it for generations to come. Britain declared war just hours after Germany's attack. On the 3rd of September 1939, only 2 days after Germany struck Poland, Britain made its solemn decision. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation in a radio broadcast, his voice steady but heavy with sorrow. He announced that Britain was now at war with Germany, a statement that would define the years ahead. Sirens wailed soon after, and many in London believed the bombing would begin that very day. Families carried gas masks, trenches were dug in parks, and blackout curtains were hung across the nation. Though the skies stayed quiet for a time, the sense of unease never left. Britain had entered the struggle knowing the price could be immense, but also recognizing that standing aside was no longer possible. It was the first step in a long and grueling fight for survival, one that would test the resilience of its people again and again. France fell in a matter of weeks. In May of 1940, German forces launched a sudden assault through the Ardennes, a forested region the Allies believed impassable to tanks. The French and British armies were caught off guard as the German blitzkrieg, lightning war, swept across Belgium and into northern France. Paris declared itself an open city to avoid destruction, and by June 14th, German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe. The French government soon signed an armistice, dividing the country into occupied and unoccupied zones. What had been expected to be a long and grinding war in the trenches instead collapsed in mere weeks. For the Allies, the fall of France was a stunning and sobering moment. It left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany in Western Europe, and it demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of speed, coordination, and surprise in modern warfare. The world watched, stunned at how quickly the map had changed. The Blitz brought nightly bombings to London. Beginning in September of 1940, London and other British cities endured months of relentless bombing raids. Known as the Blitz, short for the German word Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, these attacks turned the night sky into a canvas of fire and searchlights. Families crowded into air raid shelters, some deep in the tunnels of the underground, listening as bombs whistled down overhead. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and historic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral narrowly survived. Yet, amid destruction, resilience shone through. People emerged each morning, clearing debris, reopening shops, and continuing with daily life as best they could. The Blitz claimed tens of thousands of lives, but it also hardened Britain's spirit. The image of Londoners calmly sipping tea amid ruins became a symbol of defiance, showing the world that the city would not break under the shadow of the swastika flying across the Channel. The Battle of Britain was fought almost entirely in the air. In the summer and autumn of 1940, Britain faced invasion. Germany prepared Operation Sea Lion, a plan to cross the Channel. But first, it needed control of the skies. What followed was the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought almost entirely in the air. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes raced through the clouds to intercept German bombers and fighters. Radio operators, using the new technology of radar, guided them with precision. Pilots sometimes flew multiple missions in a single day, climbing back into their aircraft with barely a pause. Winston Churchill later praised them with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The battle ended in Britain's favor, forcing Germany to abandon its invasion plans. For the Allies, it was the first major victory of the war, and it kept hope alive. Operation Barbarossa became the largest invasion in history. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation ever undertaken, involving millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft, stretching across a front more than 1,000 miles long. At first, German forces advanced quickly, capturing vast territories and encircling entire Soviet armies. But as the weeks dragged on, the vastness of Russia, the resilience of its people, and the coming of winter turned the tide. Supply lines stretched thin, and soldiers suffered in freezing conditions they were unprepared for. The invasion opened the Eastern Front, which would become the deadliest theater of the war, consuming millions of lives. Operation Barbarossa was not only a clash of armies, but also a clash of ideologies, as Hitler sought to destroy the Soviet state. Instead, it became his greatest mistake. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days. In September of 1941, German and Finnish forces encircled the Soviet city of Leningrad, cutting it off from supplies. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history, lasting nearly 900 days. Food grew desperately scarce. Citizens ate bread made from sawdust and glue, and starvation claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the city endured. Children still attended school. Symphonies were performed in bombed-out halls, and resistance fighters defended the city's walls. Supplies trickled in across the frozen road of life, a dangerous route across Lake Ladoga. When the siege was finally lifted in January of 1944, more than 1 million people had perished, but the city had never surrendered. The endurance of Leningrad became a powerful symbol of Soviet resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, a spirit of defiance can keep the flame of survival alive. Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft swooped down on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack was sudden and devastating, sinking battleships, crippling cruisers, and destroying hundreds of aircraft. More than 2,000 American lives were lost in a matter of hours. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on America. A conflict that had once seemed far away now drew in the vast resources of the United States. Factories roared to life, armies were raised, and ships sailed across oceans. Pearl Harbor was not only a military blow but also a turning point in global history, transforming the war into a truly worldwide struggle and ensuring that its course would never be the same. The D-Day landings were the largest amphibious assault ever. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Known forever as D-Day, it began with thousands of ships crossing the English Channel, carrying troops, tanks, and supplies toward the beaches of Normandy. In the early hours, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, while bombers struck coastal defenses. As dawn broke, waves of soldiers stormed ashore under heavy fire. Despite immense losses, beachheads were secured, and by nightfall, a foothold in Europe had been gained. It was the largest amphibious assault in history, involving more than 150,000 troops in a single day. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. From the beaches of Normandy, Allied forces pushed inland, liberating towns and cities on their march toward Paris, and ultimately toward victory. It remains one of the most remarkable feats of coordination in military history. The war in the Pacific was marked by island-hopping battles. After entering the war, the United States and its allies faced the challenge of reclaiming vast stretches of territory occupied by Japan. The strategy they adopted became known as island hopping. Rather than capturing every island, Allied forces targeted key locations that could serve as bases for airfields and naval operations, slowly moving closer to Japan's home islands. Battles on places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were fierce, fought in jungles, coral reefs, and volcanic terrain. Soldiers endured heat, disease, and relentless enemy resistance. Each victory brought the Allies one step nearer to Japan, but at immense cost. By 1945, the strategy had carried them across the Pacific, setting the stage for the final battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Island hopping revealed the brutal nature of the Pacific War, a struggle where geography, endurance, and determination shaped the course of history. Hitler survived more than a dozen assassination attempts. Throughout the war, Adolf Hitler was the target of numerous plots to end his life. German officers, resistance groups, and even some within his own military sought to stop him. One of the most famous efforts came on July 20th, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb inside a briefcase at a meeting. The explosion killed several people, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries. Other plots involved poisoned food, sabotaged aircraft, and snipers waiting for the right moment. Each attempt failed, often by chance or circumstance, leaving Hitler to tighten his grip and punish conspirators harshly. The fact that he survived more than a dozen serious attempts remains one of history's unsettling curiosities. Had even one succeeded, the war's course might have been very different. But fate allowed the conflict to continue until Germany's ultimate defeat the following year. Japan once planned to invade Hawaii itself. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese leaders briefly considered an even more ambitious plan: the full invasion of Hawaii. Capturing the islands would have given Japan a powerful foothold in the Pacific, cutting off American supply lines and threatening the West Coast. However, the plan was ultimately abandoned. Hawaii was heavily defended, and the logistical challenge of supplying a large occupation force across thousands of miles of ocean proved too great. Instead, Japan turned to fortifying its existing island holdings, creating a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. While the invasion never materialized, the idea shows how bold and far-reaching Japanese strategy once aimed to be. For the people of Hawaii, the war was already close enough, with blackouts, rationing, and fears of further attacks. The thought that an invasion was once considered reminds us just how precarious the balance of power in the Pacific truly was. Submarines nearly starved Britain into submission. During the early years of the war, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic with deadly effectiveness. Their mission was simple but devastating: sink merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and raw materials to Britain. At the height of this campaign, Britain was losing hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping each month. Bread, butter, and even basic necessities grew scarce, and rationing became a way of life. Convoys, protected by destroyers and aircraft, helped reduce losses, but the danger remained constant. The Battle of the Atlantic stretched across the entire war, with sailors braving icy waters and constant threat of torpedoes. At times, it seemed Britain might be starved into surrender. Yet new technologies like sonar, improved tactics, and the breaking of German codes slowly turned the tide. The resilience of those who sailed the convoys ensured that Britain survived, keeping the nation supplied until victory was finally in sight. The Red Army lost more soldiers than any other force. On the vast Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army bore the heaviest burden of the war. From the invasion of 1941 until the final battle in Berlin, the Soviets lost staggering numbers of soldiers, more than any other military force in history. Entire divisions were wiped out, cities reduced to rubble, and countless lives consumed by the brutal clash of ideologies. The battles of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad became names etched into memory, where victory came at unimaginable cost. For every German soldier killed in the East, several Soviet soldiers often fell. Yet despite these losses, the Red Army endured, adapted, and eventually pushed westward, driving German forces back across Eastern Europe. The sacrifice was immense, leaving scars that remain in Russian memory to this day. It was a reminder that the defeat of Nazi Germany came only through suffering on a colossal scale. The United States produced almost half of all war goods. Once the United States entered the war, its vast industrial power came into play. Factories that had once produced cars and household goods were converted into plants turning out tanks, planes, and ships at astonishing speed. Women and men worked around the clock in assembly lines, welding steel and riveting aircraft wings. By the end of the conflict, the United States had produced nearly half of all war goods used by the Allies, millions of rifles, tens of thousands of aircraft, and an endless stream of supplies. Known as the Arsenal of Democracy, American industry ensured not only its own forces were supplied, but also that Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies received the weapons and materials they needed. This industrial might turned the tide of the war, proving that battles could be won not only on the front lines, but also on factory floors across the nation. German U-boats patrolled the American coastline. In the early months of 1942, German submarines appeared shockingly close to the shores of the United States. Known as Operation Drumbeat, these U-boats targeted shipping along the East Coast, sinking tankers and freighters within sight of American beaches. At night, the glow of coastal cities made silhouettes of ships, making them easy targets. It took time before blackouts, convoys, and increased patrols reduced the threat. For many Americans, the war had seemed distant. Until then, suddenly, it was on their doorstep. Fishermen spotted periscopes, lifeboats washed ashore, and coastal towns lived with the uneasy knowledge that enemy submarines lurked offshore. Though the campaign was brief compared to the broader Battle of the Atlantic, it left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that no place was entirely safe, and that the oceans surrounding America were not simply barriers, but also vulnerable front lines. Entire villages in Europe were wiped out in reprisals. In occupied Europe, acts of resistance often brought terrible retaliation. When partisans attacked German soldiers or sabotaged railways, entire villages sometimes paid the price. In places like Lidis in Czechoslovakia and Oradised Lane in France, populations were massacred and homes reduced to ashes. These reprisals were meant to terrify and suppress resistance, but often they only deepened local determination to fight back. The ruins of these villages still stand today in some places, preserved as silent memorials to those who were lost. Walking among the crumbling walls and abandoned streets is a haunting experience, a reminder that war does not only claim soldiers on battlefields, but also families in their homes. These tragedies are among the most painful legacies of the war, not battles or campaigns, but communities erased in a single day, leaving behind silence where once there had been laughter and life. Civilians made up the majority of the dead. Unlike many earlier wars, the Second World War did not confine its destruction to the battlefield. Bombing raids targeted entire cities, starvation swept through blockades, and massacres took place across occupied lands. As a result, civilians accounted for the majority of the dead. Families huddled in cellars, children carried gas masks to school, and ordinary life became entwined with survival. In Asia, Europe, and beyond, millions of people who never carried a weapon were caught in the storm. Their experiences remind us that war reshapes entire societies, not just armies. The memory of civilian suffering is preserved in diaries, in ruins, and in the quiet testimonies of survivors. It is perhaps the most sobering fact of the conflict that ordinary men, women, and children bore a weight of loss far greater than most generals or soldiers ever carried. In their stories, the true human cost of war is revealed. Rationing changed how people ate across the world. During the war, food shortages became a daily reality. In Britain, butter, sugar, and meat were rationed, with each person issued small coupons. Families grew accustomed to meals of powdered eggs, root vegetables, and inventive recipes designed to stretch every ounce. In Germany and the Soviet Union, shortages were even harsher, with many surviving on little more than bread. Across the globe, rationing changed diets, reshaped traditions, and taught entire generations to make do with less. In the United States, though food supplies were larger, ration books still limited sugar, coffee, and gasoline, reminding citizens that the war touched everyone. Rationing was not only about scarcity, but also about fairness, ensuring each person received a share. Though difficult, it fostered a sense of collective sacrifice, with people believing their small adjustments helped fuel the war effort. For many, these years left lasting memories of both hardship and ingenuity. Victory gardens fed millions during the war. To supplement rationing, families across the world planted what became known as victory gardens. In backyards, schoolyards, and even city parks, patches of earth blossomed with vegetables and herbs. In Britain and America, posters urged citizens to dig for victory, while in Canada and Australia, similar campaigns encouraged people to grow their own food. Carrots, beans, potatoes, and cabbages became staples, carefully tended by hands young and old. These gardens provided fresh produce, boosted morale, and gave families a sense of control in uncertain times. Children learned to garden alongside their parents, and neighbors often shared harvests with one another. By the end of the war, millions of tons of food had been produced this way, helping to ease shortages. The Victory Garden movement showed that even small contributions could add up to something vast. A quiet, green army of gardeners supporting those who fought abroad. Dogs, pigeons, and even dolphins served in combat roles. Animals played extraordinary roles during the Second World War, serving alongside humans in ways both practical and heroic. Dogs carried messages across battlefields, sniffed out mines, and offered companionship to weary soldiers. Pigeons, fast and silent, carried vital communications when radios failed, with some completing missions through storms and gunfire. One pigeon, named Cher Ami, famously delivered a message that saved hundreds of lives in France. Horses still pulled carts and artillery in regions where fuel was scarce, while camels, mules, and elephants carried supplies through deserts and jungles. Even dolphins were trained to locate underwater mines. These creatures, unable to understand the larger conflict, nonetheless became part of it, saving lives and shaping battles in ways often overlooked. Their quiet loyalty and resilience remind us that the war was not fought by humans alone, but by countless animals whose service was woven into the struggle for survival. Camouflage was pushed to new extremes. Deception became an art during the war, and camouflage reached levels of creativity never seen before. Soldiers painted vehicles in swirling patterns, draped nets covered with foliage, and even constructed fake trees from which snipers could observe enemy movements. Ships were painted with bold geometric designs, known as dazzle camouflage, intended to confuse enemy submarines about their speed and direction. Entire airfields were disguised, with hangars painted to resemble farmhouses or roads. In the desert, British forces built dummy tanks out of canvas and wood, while in the forests of Europe, bridges and railways were hidden beneath leaves. Camouflage was not just about blending into the background, but about tricking the eye and the mind. It was theater on the battlefield, where a painted tarp could mean the difference between survival and destruction. In this war of shadows and illusions, camouflage became a weapon all its own. Inflatable tanks fooled enemy scouts. Perhaps the most unusual deception of the war involved inflatable tanks and vehicles made from rubber and canvas. Known as dummy armor, these creations looked convincing from the air, giving the illusion of massive armies where none existed. The Allies used them extensively before the D-Day invasion, building fake camps complete with tents, trucks, and even wooden aircraft. This effort, nicknamed Operation Fortitude, was designed to trick German intelligence into believing the invasion would land at Calais instead of Normandy. Artists, stage designers, and engineers worked together to craft this illusion, turning warfare into a kind of stage performance. Pilots flying overhead often could not tell the difference, and German commanders moved troops to the wrong locations. These inflatable armies played a quiet but crucial role in confusing the enemy. They remind us that sometimes victory does not come from brute strength, but from clever imagination and deception. Propaganda films reached millions of viewers. During the war, cinema became a powerful tool of persuasion. Governments produced films to boost morale, encourage enlistment, and explain the conflict to the public. In the United States, directors like Frank Capra created the Why We Fight series, showing audiences why American involvement was necessary. In Britain, newsreels brought images of the Blitz and the battlefield into theaters each week. Germany and Japan produced their own films, designed to stir nationalism and loyalty. For many people, these screenings were their only window into the wider war, shaping how they understood events unfolding across oceans. Cartoons, too, were drafted into service, with familiar characters reminding citizens to buy war bombs or conserve resources. Propaganda films often blurred the line between truth and persuasion, but their reach was undeniable. In darkened theaters, millions absorbed images and stories that strengthened their resolve, reminding them that their sacrifices were part of something larger. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside. For children in Britain, the war brought an upheaval unlike any other. Beginning in 1939, hundreds of thousands were evacuated from cities like London and sent to live with host families in the countryside, far from the threat of bombing. Carrying small suitcases and gas masks, children boarded trains, often without knowing where they were going. Some found kindness and safety in their new homes, while others faced loneliness and hardship. Similar evacuations occurred in other countries, as families sought to shield their youngest members from the dangers of war. For many children, these years were filled with strange memories. Fields and farms instead of familiar city streets, new schools, and long separations from parents. The evacuation program left deep marks on an entire generation, shaping their lives with both loss and resilience, and forever tying childhood memories to the great conflict of the age. Some countries used monopoly boards to smuggle escape tools. One of the most ingenious wartime deceptions came in the form of an ordinary board game. In Britain, specially prepared monopoly sets were sent to prisoners of war in German camps under the guise of charitable aid. Hidden within the boards were maps printed on silk, compasses, and even real money tucked among the play currency. These games provided escape tools to those planning daring flights from captivity. The plan was a collaboration between toy makers and military intelligence, blending creativity with necessity. For many prisoners, the arrival of these disguised games was a spark of hope, a reminder that they had not been forgotten. While not every set led to a successful escape, the very idea reveals the extraordinary lengths to which ingenuity was applied during the war. Even something as simple as a family board game could become a weapon of freedom in desperate times. Enigma machines were captured from German submarines. The German Enigma machine, used to encode military messages, was thought to be unbreakable. Its complex system of rotors and wires produced countless possible combinations, and German commanders believed their communications were secure. Yet the Allies' success in breaking Enigma began not in quiet code-breaking rooms alone, but also at sea. On daring missions, Allied sailors captured U-boats and retrieved Enigma machines, along with vital codebooks. These dangerous efforts provided the key material needed for cryptographers at Bletchley Park to decode messages. Each capture was a race against time, as crews often tried to destroy their machines before surrendering. The risks were enormous, but the rewards were greater. With access to these secrets, the Allies could track submarines, anticipate attacks, and save convoys. The story of Enigma is not only one of mathematics, but also of courage on the high seas, where victory sometimes came from salvaged machines pulled from the depths. Soviet snipers became legends on the Eastern Front. On the vast battlefields of the Soviet Union, snipers became heroes and symbols of resistance. Among them was Vasily Zaitsev, who claimed hundreds of kills during the Battle of Stalingrad, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the most successful female snipers in history. With patience, precision, and nerves of steel, These sharpshooters turned the ruins of cities into deadly hunting grounds. They were not only feared by their enemies, but celebrated by their comrades, their stories spreading through newspapers and broadcasts to boost morale. For Soviet soldiers facing overwhelming odds, the exploits of snipers were proof that even a single well-placed shot could change the course of a battle. These individuals embodied resilience, skill, and determination. Their legacy endures as a reminder that wars are fought not only with massive armies and machines, but also with the steady hand and unbreakable will of lone marksmen hidden in the rubble. The Winter War showed Finland's fierce resistance. In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, expecting a swift victory. Instead, Finnish forces resisted with extraordinary determination in what became known as the Winter War. Dressed in white camouflage, Finnish soldiers moved silently across snowy forests, striking Soviet columns and disappearing into the landscape. They used skis to travel quickly and knew the terrain intimately, turning the bitter cold into an ally. Though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Finland inflicted heavy losses, earning admiration worldwide. Ultimately, Finland was forced to cede territory, but its defense became legendary. The image of small groups of soldiers defying a massive army inspired stories of courage and ingenuity. The Winter War demonstrated that sheer numbers do not always guarantee victory, and that the spirit of a people fighting for their homeland can leave a mark far larger than the size of their army might suggest. Radar revolutionized how battles were fought. One of the quiet revolutions of the war was the widespread use of radar. By sending out invisible radio waves and detecting their reflections, radar allowed operators to see approaching aircraft or ships long before they were visible to the eye. In the Battle of Britain, radar stations along the English coast provided crucial warnings of incoming German raids, giving fighters time to scramble into the skies. At sea, radar helped Allied ships detect U-boats and navigate through darkness and storms. This technology changed the very nature of warfare, shifting the advantage toward those who could see first. Though still in its infancy, radar proved indispensable, saving countless lives and shaping strategies across every theater. After the war, its applications would spread into aviation, weather forecasting, and beyond. But its story began in the tense days when knowing what lay beyond the horizon could mean the difference between survival and defeat. The war inspired the invention of the jet engine. Before the Second World War, aircraft relied entirely on propellers. But engineers in Germany and Britain were already experimenting with something new: the jet engine. During the conflict, this technology leapt forward, producing the first jet-powered planes. Germany's Messerschmitt Me 262 became the world's first operational jet fighter, its speed unmatched by anything the Allies had. Though introduced too late to change the war's outcome, it showed the future of aviation. Britain, too, tested its own jets, paving the way for post-war designs. These early engines were temperamental, often failing or consuming fuel too quickly, but they represented a new era. From these wartime beginnings grew the sleek airliners and supersonic jets of the decades that followed. The roar of jet power, once a novelty, would become the sound of modern flight, a reminder that even in war, technology often pushes forward into tomorrow. Rockets were first used as long-range weapons. The idea of launching weapons through the sky was not new, but the Second World War turned rockets from experiments into reality. Germany developed the V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless aircraft that buzzed ominously before striking its targets in Britain. More advanced still was the V-2 rocket, the first weapon to travel faster than sound and reach the edge of space before crashing down. Civilians in London, Antwerp, and other cities experienced these sudden, unstoppable strikes, against which there was no real defense. Though terrifying, these weapons also marked the birth of modern rocketry. After the war, captured scientists and technology from Germany became the foundation for both American and Soviet space programs. In a way, the race to the moon began with weapons designed for destruction. The story of rockets in the war is both haunting and remarkable, a reminder of how invention can serve many paths. Antibiotics saved countless soldiers' lives. Before the 1940s, infection was one of the greatest dangers for wounded soldiers. Even small cuts could become deadly. But during the war, the mass production of penicillin changed everything. First discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, it was refined and produced on a large scale during the conflict, turning a fragile laboratory discovery into a medical revolution. For the first time, doctors could reliably treat infections that once claimed lives by the thousands. Soldiers wounded in battle had a much greater chance of survival, and the benefits quickly extended to civilians as well. The war accelerated research, building factories capable of producing the drug in vast quantities. Penicillin became one of the quiet heroes of the conflict, saving lives not with weapons, but with healing. Its legacy endures today as the beginning of the antibiotic age that has protected millions across the world. The Jeep became a symbol of mobility. Among the countless vehicles produced during the war, one stood out as both practical and iconic: the Jeep. Officially called the Willys MB, it was designed to be lightweight, durable, and capable of handling nearly any terrain. With its boxy frame, open sides, and simple mechanics, it could be repaired easily in the field. Jeeps carried officers, hauled supplies, and even mounted weapons. They crossed deserts, jungles, and battlefields, earning a reputation as nearly indestructible. Soldiers loved them, and after the war, many brought the design home, leading to the civilian Jeep that remains popular today. More than 600,000 were built during the conflict, making the little vehicle a symbol of American ingenuity and adaptability. In photos and films, the Jeep is often seen bouncing across muddy tracks or carrying smiling troops, a reminder of how something small and rugged became an enduring face of mobility in wartime. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. For the first time in history, entire units of soldiers were delivered to battle from the sky. Paratroopers leapt from aircraft in waves, their parachutes opening as they drifted into enemy territory. Germany pioneered this tactic in the early war years, seizing key bridges and airfields with sudden airborne assaults. The Allies soon followed, training elite divisions like the American 82nd and 101st Airborne. On D-Day, thousands of paratroopers dropped into Normandy hours before the seaborne invasion, disrupting German defenses and securing vital positions. The landings were dangerous. Many soldiers were scattered, injured, or killed before even reaching the ground. Yet their courage and surprise often turned the tide of battles. The image of paratroopers descending from the night sky became one of the war's most dramatic symbols, a reminder that victory sometimes depended on those willing to leap into the unknown. Flamethrowers were widely used for the first time. Though primitive versions had appeared in earlier conflicts, the Second World War saw flamethrowers used on a large scale. These weapons projected streams of burning fuel, clearing bunkers, trenches, and caves where enemy soldiers sheltered. They were terrifying to behold, both to those who used them and to those who faced them. In the dense jungles of the Pacific, flamethrowers became especially common, as Japanese defenders built fortified tunnels and positions that were nearly impossible to take with conventional arms. The weapon's psychological impact was often greater than its physical destruction, as fear alone could drive defenders to surrender. Yet flamethrowers also symbolized the brutal reality of modern warfare, tools designed to overcome the stalemate of entrenched fighting at a terrible human cost. Their widespread use during this conflict left a lasting impression, leading to debates about the ethics of such weapons long after the war ended. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as dominant at sea. Before the war, battleships were considered the kings of the ocean, massive, heavily armed, and nearly indestructible. But the Second World War proved otherwise. The true power now lay with aircraft carriers, floating airfields capable of projecting force across vast distances. At battles like Midway and the Coral Sea, opposing fleets never even saw each other directly, as planes launched from carriers delivered the decisive blows. These ships carried dozens of aircraft, allowing navies to strike hundreds of miles away. The shift was dramatic. Mighty battleships that had once ruled the waves were suddenly vulnerable without air cover. By the war's end, carriers were the centerpiece of naval strategy, a role they still hold today. The rise of the aircraft carrier during the war marked one of the greatest transformations in military history, a change in which the sea became a stage for battles fought in the sky. Sonar helped hunt submarines beneath the waves. As German U-boats stalked convoys across the Atlantic, the Allies turned to new technology to fight back. Sonar, short for sound navigation and ranging, used sound waves to detect objects underwater. Ships sent out pings that echoed off submarines, revealing their positions even in the darkness of the deep. Operators listened intently through headphones, translating faint sounds into life-or-death warnings. With sonar, destroyers could chase submarines more effectively, dropping depth charges with greater accuracy. Though far from perfect, this technology shifted the balance in the Battle of the Atlantic, giving merchant ships a better chance of survival. Sonar was also used to map the seafloor and detect hazards, showing that its usefulness went far beyond war. Its wartime development laid the foundation for decades of exploration beneath the ocean's surface. But during the conflict, it was a vital tool in the desperate struggle to keep supply lines alive. The VTU rocket was the world's first ballistic missile. Developed in Germany under the direction of Wernher von Braun, the V2 rocket was unlike anything seen before. Launched vertically, it soared high into the edge of space before crashing down at supersonic speeds, carrying a deadly explosive payload. First used in 1944, these rockets struck London, Antwerp, and other cities with terrifying suddenness. Unlike bombers, they could not be intercepted, and their arrival gave no warning. Though they caused great destruction, they were deployed too late, and in too few numbers to alter the course of the war. Yet their significance lay not only in the damage they inflicted, but in the technology they introduced. The V2 was the forerunner of modern space rockets and missiles. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to capture this knowledge, setting the stage for the space age born from the ashes of conflict. Germany experimented with jet fighters late in the war. As the war dragged on, Germany sought new technologies to turn the tide. Among its most ambitious projects were jet-powered aircraft, far faster than traditional fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the most famous, capable of outrunning any Allied plane. Introduced in 1944, it terrified pilots who encountered it. But the aircraft was plagued by problems: engines that wore out quickly, shortages of fuel, and limited numbers that could be built. Hitler also insisted the jets be used as bombers rather than purely as fighters, limiting their effectiveness. Although these machines could have posed a serious threat if deployed earlier, they arrived too late to change the war's outcome. Instead, they became a glimpse of the future. The jet fighters of late-war Germany were a preview of aviation's next chapter, showing what flight would become in the decades that followed. Entire populations were displaced across Europe. The Second World War uprooted millions from their homes. As armies advanced and borders shifted, civilians fled in endless streams along roads choked with carts, wagons, and weary feet. Some escaped bombed cities, while others were forced to leave by occupying armies. Jewish families were deported to ghettos and camps, while ethnic minorities were relocated under brutal policies. By the war's end, Europe held tens of millions of displaced people, one of the largest movements of humanity in history. Villages emptied, families were scattered, and generations grew up with stories of lost homelands. Many never returned to their birthplaces, as borders had changed forever. These migrations reshaped the cultural map of Europe, leaving scars that lingered long after the guns fell silent. In every refugee camp, in every crowded train, the war wrote its story not just in battles, but in the wandering footsteps of the displaced. Refugee camps sprang up across the Middle East. The upheaval of war in Europe stretched far beyond its borders. As people fled the violence, many sought safety in the Middle East, where camps appeared in places like Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Iran. Poles, Greeks, and other Europeans found themselves living in tents and makeshift shelters far from home, their lives suspended between war and peace. Local communities sometimes shared what little they had, while aid organizations struggled to provide food, medicine, and schooling for children. For many refugees, these camps were both sanctuaries and prisons, safe from bombing, yet far from the familiarity of home. The presence of so many newcomers changed the fabric of the region, adding to its already complex tapestry of cultures and histories. These forgotten refugee camps remind us that the war's reach was global, touching not only battlefields, but also the quiet lives of those displaced and searching for safety. Japan forced thousands into harsh prison camps. Across Asia and the Pacific, captured soldiers and civilians faced grim fates in Japanese prison camps. In places like the Philippines, Burma, and Malaya, thousands of Allied troops were forced on brutal marches with little food or water. Survivors were packed into camps where disease, malnutrition, and overwork claimed countless lives. Civilians, too, were imprisoned, from European colonists to local populations deemed hostile. Some were transported in overcrowded hell ships, where conditions were suffocating. These experiences left deep scars on those who survived, many carrying the memories for the rest of their lives. Yet even in such conditions, resilience persisted. Prisoners created secret radios, staged plays, and taught classes to maintain hope. The suffering endured in these camps was immense, but it also revealed the strength of the human will, a determination to hold on, to endure, and to live for the day when freedom would finally come. The Warsaw Ghetto became a symbol of resistance. In 1940, German authorities forced hundreds of thousands of Jews into a walled-off district of Warsaw, creating the largest ghetto in occupied Europe. Conditions were horrific. Overcrowding, starvation, and disease claimed thousands of lives each month. Yet amid despair, resistance grew. In April of 1943, when German forces attempted to liquidate the ghetto, fighters rose up with smuggled weapons and fierce determination. For weeks, they held out against overwhelming odds, fighting not for survival alone, but for dignity and defiance. Though the uprising was eventually crushed and the ghetto destroyed, the courage of its defenders echoed across the world. The Warsaw Ghetto remains a symbol of resistance against tyranny, showing that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit can rise in defiance. It is a story remembered not just for its tragedy, but for the unyielding strength of those who refused to submit. Anne Frank wrote her diary while in hiding. In a secret annex in Amsterdam, a young girl named Anne Frank recorded her thoughts in a simple diary. From 1942 until 1944, Anne, her family, and several others lived in hiding to escape Nazi persecution. She wrote about her daily life, her hopes, her fears, and her dreams for a better future. Though still a teenager, her words carried wisdom far beyond her years. After the family was betrayed and deported, Anne's diary was preserved by those who found it. Published after the war, it has been translated into dozens of languages, becoming one of the most widely read books in the world. Through her words, millions have glimpsed the human side of history, the laughter, frustrations, and longings of a girl caught in extraordinary times. Anne Frank's diary endures as a voice of hope and humanity in the midst of unimaginable hardship. The Kindertransport saved thousands of Jewish children. Before the outbreak of war, Britain launched a rescue effort known as the Kindertransport, the Children's Transport. From 1938 to 1939, trains carried nearly 10,000 Jewish children out of Nazi-occupied territories and into safety. Most traveled without their parents, clutching small bags and tags around their necks. Families in Britain opened their homes to them, offering shelter and a chance of survival. For many children, it meant a future they would not otherwise have had. Yet the separations were heartbreaking, as most never saw their parents again. The Kindertransport stands as both a story of compassion and of sorrow, a reminder of what was lost and of what was saved. The courage of those who organized and supported the rescue ensured that thousands of lives and countless future generations were preserved even as darkness spread across Europe. Japanese Americans were interned in the United States. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, fear and suspicion swept across the United States. In 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the forced relocation of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens. Families were uprooted from their homes on the West Coast and sent to internment camps in remote areas of the country. They lived in barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers. Though not prison camps in the harshest sense, conditions were difficult, and the injustice weighed heavily on those confined. Many lost their businesses, farms, and possessions, never to regain them. Decades later, the government formally apologized and offered reparations, acknowledging the violation of civil rights. The internment of Japanese Americans remains a sobering reminder of how fear can lead to injustice, and how even in a democracy, the balance between security and freedom can falter in times of war. Italian partisans fought a brutal resistance war. After Mussolini's fall in 1943, Italy became a divided land. German forces occupied the north, while the Allies advanced from the south. In between, partisan groups of Italians waged a fierce resistance. Armed with stolen weapons and fighting from the mountains, they sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and spread information to undermine the occupiers. The struggle was dangerous, reprisals against civilians were brutal, and many partisans were executed. Yet their determination never faltered. The partisans were a diverse group: students, farmers, workers, and even former soldiers who refused to accept fascism's return. Their efforts tied down German divisions, aided the Allied advance, and played a vital role in liberating their homeland. The Italian resistance is remembered as both a military effort and a moral stand, a testament to ordinary people who risked everything for freedom and dignity in their country's darkest hours. Civilians in China suffered mass atrocities. Long before the war reached Europe, China had already endured years of brutal conflict. Beginning in 1937, Japanese forces invaded large parts of the country, bringing devastation to cities and villages alike. Civilians suffered horrific atrocities, including massacres, forced labor, and starvation. The city of Nanjing became infamous after weeks of slaughter and violence claimed countless lives. Millions of Chinese perished during the years of occupation, their suffering often overlooked in Western histories of the war. Yet their resilience was extraordinary. Villages rebuilt after destruction, resistance fighters continued their struggle, and families endured unimaginable hardship. The Chinese experience of the war remains one of its greatest tragedies, a reminder that the conflict was not confined to Europe, but stretched across Asia with equal ferocity. To remember this chapter is to acknowledge the immense suffering of civilians who had little voice but bore unbearable burdens. Millions were left homeless by the war. By the war's end, Europe and Asia were filled with ruins. Bombed-out cities left entire populations without shelter, their homes reduced to rubble. Families crowded into cellars, abandoned schools, and makeshift shelters, braving cold winters and uncertain futures. Refugees wandered from town to town, searching for lost relatives or a safe place to rest. In Germany, Poland, Japan, and many other countries, millions faced homelessness on a scale unimaginable today. Governments and aid organizations struggled to provide food and housing, while rebuilding stretched into decades. For many, the end of the war did not mean immediate peace, but years of hardship as they tried to piece their lives back together. The sight of vast, roofless cities and endless refugee camps became symbols of the destruction left behind. Yet from these ashes, communities slowly rose again, rebuilding stone by stone, determined to reclaim lives interrupted by war. Churchill's speeches stirred a nation's resolve. In the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill became more than a prime minister. He became a voice of defiance. His speeches, delivered over the radio and in Parliament, carried across the nation with words that burned into memory. He promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat, yet those words inspired courage. When the threat of invasion loomed, he vowed that Britain would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets. To many, these were not just speeches, but lifelines, a reminder that surrender was unthinkable. Even as bombs fell during the Blitz, his voice echoed through shelters, giving strength to weary civilians. Churchill's oratory remains one of the enduring legacies of the war, the power of words to steel a nation's will against despair. Roosevelt's fireside chats brought comfort to Americans. Across the Atlantic, another leader used words to steady his people. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to Americans through his famous fireside chats, radio broadcasts that made distant events feel close and frightening uncertainties feel manageable. Sitting in their living rooms, families gathered around radios as Roosevelt explained rationing, war production, and the progress of battles in calm, measured tones. He spoke not like a distant official, but like a trusted neighbor, reassuring and clear. For many, his chats became part of wartime life, offering comfort in anxious times. Roosevelt understood that the home front was as vital as the front lines, and that confidence was as important as weapons. His voice reminded Americans that they were part of something larger, united in a common cause. Long after the war, those who listened remembered his warmth and steadiness, a president who seemed to sit beside them in their homes. Stalin relocated Soviet industry far east of Moscow. When German armies surged deep into Soviet territory in 1941, Joseph Stalin made a drastic decision. Entire factories, including their workers and machinery, were dismantled piece by piece and transported thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of advancing forces. Trains carried heavy equipment across the vastness of Russia to places like the Ural Mountains and Siberia. There, new industrial cities rose almost overnight, producing tanks, planes, and weapons under brutal conditions. Workers labored in freezing temperatures, often with little food or rest, yet the production never ceased. This massive relocation saved the Soviet war effort, While the front lines raged in the west, factories far away churned out the tools of survival. The relocation of Soviet industry remains one of the most astonishing feats of wartime logistics, proving that in a struggle of endurance, the ability to rebuild and adapt can decide the fate of nations. Mussolini's regime fell before the war ended. Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, entered the war as Hitler's ally, promising glory and conquest. But Italian forces suffered repeated defeats in North Africa, Greece, and beyond. By 1943, discontent at home grew unbearable. Allied forces landed in Sicily, and soon after, Mussolini was deposed by his own government. He was imprisoned, only to be rescued by German commandos and placed in charge of a puppet state in northern Italy. Yet his power was gone, and the Italian people turned against him. Partisan fighters eventually captured Mussolini in April of 1945 as the war drew to its close. His downfall was swift and final, a stark contrast to the ambitions with which he had entered the conflict. Mussolini's fate showed that even powerful dictators could fall, their promises of empire reduced to ruins amid the greater storm of war. Hirohito spoke directly to the Japanese people for the first time. For centuries, Japanese emperors were seen as distant figures, rarely heard by their people. But on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation directly for the first time. His voice, calm and formal, was broadcast over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. Many Japanese citizens, unaccustomed to hearing him, wept as they listened. His words were carefully chosen, stating that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage and that continuing would only bring ruin. Though couched in formal language, the message was clear. The fighting was over. For millions who had endured years of hardship, his voice carried both sorrow and relief. The broadcast remains one of the most significant moments in Japanese history. The voice of a living God, breaking centuries of silence to bring an empire's war to its end, and to open the path toward peace, rebuilding. De Gaulle led free France from exile. When France fell to Germany in 1940, many believed its struggle was over. But one determined general, Charles de Gaulle, refused to surrender. From exile in London, he broadcast speeches calling on French soldiers and citizens to continue resisting. He organized the Free French Forces, a coalition of troops, sailors, and airmen who fought alongside the Allies. Though at first his movement was small, it grew steadily, becoming the symbol of France's unbroken spirit. De Gaulle traveled widely, rallying support in colonies across Africa and the Middle East, keeping the flame of French independence alive. When Paris was finally liberated in 1944, de Gaulle marched through the streets at the head of Free French troops, a triumphant return for the man who had refused to yield. His leadership showed that even in exile, a single voice can preserve the hope of a nation. Eisenhower commanded the largest army in history. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a relatively unknown general before the war, rose to command the Allied forces in Europe. His task was immense, coordinating armies from the United States, Britain, Canada, Free France, and more. By 1944, he oversaw the largest assembled military force in history, directing millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen across multiple fronts. His calm demeanor and talent for diplomacy made him the ideal leader to hold together a coalition of strong personalities and differing national interests. Eisenhower planned and executed Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, one of the most complex operations ever attempted. Though faced with immense responsibility, he bore it with quiet steadiness. After the war, his reputation as a unifying leader carried him all the way to the American presidency. Eisenhower's story is a reminder that sometimes history's greatest figures are not those who seek power, but those who shoulder it when called. Montgomery and Rommel dueled in North Africa. In the deserts of North Africa, two generals became legendary adversaries: Britain's Bernard Montgomery and Germany's Erwin Rommel. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, was admired for his daring maneuvers and bold tactics. Montgomery, calm and methodical, emphasized careful planning and overwhelming force. Their armies clashed in sweeping battles across sand and scrub, where tanks churned the desert floor and supply lines stretched to breaking. The Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 proved decisive, as Montgomery's forces halted Rommel's advance and turned the tide in North Africa. The duel between these commanders became one of the war's most famous rivalries, symbolizing both the ferocity of desert warfare and the clash of military styles. Though enemies, both earned the respect of friend and foe alike, their names forever linked in the history of a theater where the desert itself was as much an adversary as the opposing army. Patton's tanks helped break through in Europe. General George S. Patton was one of America's most flamboyant and controversial commanders, but also one of its most effective. Leading the Third Army, he unleashed armored divisions across Europe after the D-Day landings. His tanks moved with astonishing speed, breaking through German lines and liberating vast territories. Patton was known for his fiery speeches, strict discipline and relentless drive, often pushing his men to cover distances thought impossible. During the Battle of the Bulge, his forces wheeled north in harsh winter conditions to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, a maneuver that remains a classic of military history. Though sometimes criticized for his bluntness, Patton inspired fierce loyalty in his troops and fear in his enemies. His aggressive use of armor helped ensure the rapid collapse of German defenses, making him one of the war's most dynamic and memorable commanders. MacArthur vowed to return to the Philippines. In 1942, as Japanese forces overwhelmed the Philippines, American General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to withdraw to Australia. Before leaving, he declared, "I shall return." For the Filipino people and Allied forces, these words became a promise of hope. Over the next 2 years, MacArthur planned the long campaign across the Pacific, island by island, drawing ever closer to the Philippines. In October of 1944, he waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his vow before cheering crowds. His return marked the beginning of the liberation of the islands, a campaign that restored Filipino independence after years of brutal occupation. MacArthur's dramatic promise and its fulfillment became one of the war's most famous moments, blending strategy with symbolism. To those who had endured hardship under Japanese rule, his words were more than rhetoric. They were a pledge of freedom kept against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point. In the summer of 1942, German forces advanced deep into the Soviet Union, reaching the city of Stalingrad on the banks of the Volga River. What followed was one of the most brutal battles in history. Street by street, building by building, soldiers fought in the rubble of factories and apartment blocks. Civilians endured constant bombardment, clinging to survival in cellars. By winter, the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off supplies and trapping more than 200,000 men. When the Germans finally surrendered in February of 1943, the loss was catastrophic. Stalingrad became the turning point of the war in the East, proving that Hitler's advance could be stopped. The cost was staggering, millions dead or wounded, but the Soviet victory sent shockwaves across the world, a signal that momentum had shifted and that Germany's downfall had begun. Midway changed the balance in the Pacific. In June of 1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States scored a decisive victory in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. Japanese forces planned to lure the American fleet into a trap, but thanks to codebreakers, the US Navy knew their intentions. In a matter of hours, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling the heart of Japan's naval power. The victory was astonishing, especially as the United States lost only one carrier in return. From that moment, Japan could no longer easily replace its losses, while American industry surged ahead. Midway marked the shift from defensive battles to an Allied offensive that would push steadily across the Pacific. For sailors and pilots, the battle was a whirlwind of bravery and chance. But in history, it became the moment the tide turned. The Pacific, once dominated by Japan, was now contested. El Alamein marked the beginning of Axis defeat. In the deserts of North Africa, near the small railway stop of El Alamein, British forces under General Montgomery faced Rommel's German and Italian troops in October of 1942. The battle raged for nearly 2 weeks, with tanks clashing across the sand and artillery thundering into the night. When the smoke cleared, the Allies had won a decisive victory. Winston Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The triumph forced the Axis to retreat across North Africa, opening the door for Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria. El Alamein was more than a battle of tanks and guns. It was a turning point in morale. For the first time, the Allies felt the momentum shift, and the legend of Rommel's invincibility was broken. The desert winds carried news of hope, whispering that victory was finally within reach. Kursk was the largest tank battle ever fought. In July of 1943, German and Soviet forces clashed near the city of Kursk in what became the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of armored vehicles thundered across the fields, their guns roaring as dust and smoke choked the summer air. The Germans hoped to regain the initiative after Stalingrad, but the Soviets, forewarned, had prepared massive defenses with minefields, trenches, and fortified lines. The fighting was immense and unrelenting, but the Red Army held firm. The German offensive collapsed, and from then on the Soviets maintained the upper hand on the Eastern Front. Kursk was not only a clash of steel, but a test of endurance. The sheer scale of the battle symbolized the industrial might of both nations, each throwing everything into the struggle. In the end, the fields of Kursk bore witness to the moment when Germany's hopes of victory in the east were finally extinguished. The Ardennes offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December of 1944, as winter gripped Europe, Germany launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack created a bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. American troops, caught off guard, faced bitter fighting in snow-covered villages and forests. The siege of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held out despite encirclement, became legendary. General Patton's rapid counterattack helped relieve the defenders and turn the tide. Though Germany achieved initial success, the offensive drained its remaining reserves. By January of 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive in the West, a desperate gamble that ultimately failed. For those who fought in the freezing forests, it was a test of endurance, courage, and resilience in the war's final, bitter winter. Guadalcanal was the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. In August of 1942, American forces landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, marking the first major Allied offensive against Japan. The campaign lasted 6 grueling months, fought in dense jungles and shark-infested waters. Soldiers battled not only enemy troops, but also malaria, hunger, and exhaustion. Control of the island's airfield was crucial, as it allowed planes to dominate the surrounding seas. The struggle seesawed back and forth, with both sides suffering heavy losses in ships, aircraft, and men. In the end, the Allies prevailed, securing the island and halting Japan's expansion. Guadalcanal was more than a battle for land. It was a battle of wills. The victory gave the Allies confidence and marked the beginning of their long push across the Pacific, step by step, toward Japan itself. It showed that the tide could be turned, even in the most forbidding of places. Okinawa saw ferocious fighting near Japan's home islands. In April of 1945, American forces invaded the island of Okinawa, only a few hundred miles from Japan's home islands. The battle lasted nearly 3 months and became the largest and bloodiest campaign in the Pacific. Japanese defenders, entrenched in caves and tunnels, fought with desperate tenacity, while kamikaze pilots launched waves of suicide attacks against Allied ships. The toll was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and entire towns were reduced to rubble. For the Allies, Okinawa provided a vital base for the planned invasion of Japan. But the horrific cost raised questions about how such an invasion could ever succeed. The battle's ferocity influenced the decision to use atomic bombs later that summer. Okinawa was a place where bravery and suffering stood side by side, a final chapter in the island struggles that defined the Pacific War. Iwo Jima produced one of the war's most famous photographs. In February of 1945, American Marines stormed the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The island, heavily fortified by Japanese defenders, became the site of one of the most intense battles of the war. For weeks, soldiers fought in caves, bunkers, and tunnels, enduring relentless resistance. Amid the carnage came a moment captured in an image that would become iconic: 6 Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph, taken by Joe Rosenthal, symbolized the determination and sacrifice of those who fought. Though the battle cost thousands of lives on both sides, the island's capture provided a crucial airbase for bombers striking Japan. Iwo Jima remains etched in memory not only for its strategic importance, but also for that single, powerful image, a frozen moment of triumph amid the smoke and ruin of one of the Pacific's fiercest battles. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted the entire war. From 1939 until 1945, the Atlantic Ocean was a constant battlefield. German U-boats hunted convoys carrying vital supplies to Britain, while Allied destroyers and aircraft worked tirelessly to protect them. The struggle stretched across the entire war, a long and grinding contest of endurance. At times, the losses were devastating, with ships sunk faster than they could be replaced. Sailors faced freezing waters, storms, and the ever-present fear of torpedoes. Yet slowly, the tide turned. Advances in sonar, long-range aircraft, and code-breaking tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. By the war's end, the U-boat threat was contained, and the Atlantic remained open. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single clash, but a drawn-out struggle fought in silence and shadow, where the survival of nations depended on the courage of those who sailed its perilous waters. Burma's jungles became a harsh battlefield. In Southeast Asia, the dense jungles of Burma, now Myanmar, became the setting for a grueling campaign. Allied and Japanese forces battled through sweltering heat, monsoon rains, and impenetrable forests. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire, but also disease, leeches, and exhaustion. Supply lines were difficult to maintain, and entire units struggled simply to survive in the unforgiving terrain. Local peoples, including the famed Chindits and Gurkhas, played vital roles, guiding troops and fighting with extraordinary bravery. For years, Burma was a forgotten front compared to Europe and the Pacific, but it was crucial in keeping supply routes open to China. Victory came slowly, at great cost, with battles won yard by yard. The campaign in Burma showed that the war was not only fought in cities and seas, but also in remote jungles where the environment itself became an unrelenting enemy. Millions of letters were sent across the front lines. In an age before instant communication, letters were the lifeline that kept soldiers and families connected. Millions were written during the war, carried by trains, planes, and ships across continents and oceans. Soldiers wrote from muddy trenches, swaying ships, and crowded barracks, pouring out thoughts of home, love, and longing. Families replied with news of daily life, words of encouragement, and photographs tucked carefully between pages. Mail delivery was not always certain. Letters sometimes arrived months late or never at all, yet each envelope carried immeasurable weight. For many, the arrival of a letter was the brightest moment in long stretches of hardship, a reminder of humanity amid the machinery of war. Even brief notes offered comfort, giving courage to face another day. These written words, fragile and personal, formed invisible threads that bound distant hearts together across the vast expanse of the conflict. Wartime songs became anthems of hope. Music was a companion to soldiers and civilians alike, offering escape and reassurance when the world felt uncertain. In Britain, Vera Lynn's voice carried across the airwaves, singing "We'll Meet Again," a promise of reunion that comforted those separated by war. In America, swing music filled dance halls, keeping spirits high despite rationing and anxiety. Soldiers sang as they marched, harmonizing in muddy camps or aboard troop ships, using rhythm and melody to soften their burdens. Even in occupied countries, quiet songs of resistance and patriotism lifted morale. Music gave shape to hope, reminding listeners that joy could survive even amid rubble and ruin. For those who lived through the war, these songs became inseparable from memory, forever linked with moments of fear, longing, and resilience. To hear them today is to hear the heartbeat of a generation that endured hardship with courage and the comfort of melody. Blackout curtains darkened entire cities. To protect against nighttime bombing raids, cities across the world were plunged into darkness. In London, Berlin, Tokyo, and countless others, blackout curtains covered every window, streetlights were extinguished, and vehicles dimmed their headlights. Even the glow of a cigarette could draw attention from the sky. Wardens patrolled streets to enforce the rules, tapping on doors if light slipped through a crack. The absence of illumination gave cities an eerie, dreamlike quality. Familiar streets became shadowy and strange. For civilians, life was conducted in twilight, stumbling through darkened neighborhoods and listening for the distant drone of aircraft. The blackout was both a defense and a constant reminder of danger. Yet it also created moments of quiet intimacy. Families gathered by candlelight, neighbors whispered under the stars, and the night sky, freed of city glare, revealed constellations that had been hidden for generations. Cigarettes became a common soldier's comfort. Among the items most treasured by soldiers were cigarettes. They were included in rations, traded like currency, and smoked during moments of rest between battles. The ritual of lighting one offered a brief escape, a pause that calmed nerves and filled long stretches of waiting. Photographs from the era often show soldiers with cigarettes in hand, their smoke curling above helmets and trenches. For many, it was a way to steady trembling hands, to share camaraderie with comrades, or to ease hunger when food was scarce. Cigarettes crossed every rank and nationality, uniting generals and privates alike in a habit that defined the wartime experience. After the war, cigarette companies capitalized on this association, but the health consequences would later become clear. During the war itself, however, cigarettes were less about addiction than about comfort. A small, fragile flame against the vast darkness of conflict. Cartoons spread political messages. Animation and illustration became tools of persuasion during the war. Governments used cartoons to explain rationing, encourage war bond purchases, and mock the enemy. Familiar characters like Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, and even Mickey Mouse appeared in propaganda shorts, bringing humor to serious topics. Cartoons reached wide audiences, including children, making complex issues easier to understand and remember. In newspapers and magazines, political cartoons skewered leaders, lifted morale, and rallied support. Some caricatures became iconic, exaggerating features of dictators to make them appear foolish or menacing. The blend of humor and message proved powerful, softening the edges of fear with laughter. While these cartoons were light-hearted on the surface, they carried serious intent, shaping public opinion, reinforcing unity, and reminding audiences that the war was not only fought with weapons, but also with pen, ideas. Their legacy shows how even art and laughter became part of the arsenal of war. Christmas was celebrated even in the trenches. Despite the hardships of war, soldiers and civilians clung to traditions. Christmas, in particular, was observed whenever and wherever possible. Soldiers at the front lines decorated small trees with scraps of tinsel or makeshift ornaments. Carols were sung in muddy dugouts, sometimes joined by comrades from distant homelands. Families on the home front exchanged modest gifts, often handmade, and shared meals of rationed food dressed up for the holiday. In prisoner of war camps, men carved toys or staged plays to mark the season. Though far from peaceful, these moments of celebration offered warmth and humanity amid the cold machinery of conflict. The holiday reminded soldiers of home, of loved ones waiting, and of the life they hoped to return to. Even in the darkest winters, Christmas lights, however small, flickered against the night, symbols of resilience and the enduring spirit of joy. Radio broadcasts boosted morale. The radio was the heartbeat of the war years, carrying news, speeches, and music across borders. Families gathered around their sets to hear leaders speak. Soldiers at the front tuned in to programs from home, and resistance groups listened secretly to banned broadcasts. In occupied Europe, voices from the BBC offered hope, breaking through enemy propaganda with messages of truth and encouragement. In America, shows like Command Performance played songs requested by servicemen overseas, linking them back to home. Radio crossed oceans and front lines, connecting people separated by distance and danger. Its immediacy made it powerful. The crackle of a voice across the air could change moods, inspire courage, or bring comfort. For many, the sound of the radio became inseparable from the memory of the war, a reminder of how technology carried not only orders and information, but also companionship and hope. Posters encouraged secrecy with slogans like "Loose lips sink ships." Colorful posters covered the walls of cities, factories, and schools, carrying bold messages about the war effort. One of the most memorable warned, "Loose lips sink ships," reminding citizens that careless talk could give information to spies or enemies. Similar posters urged people to save fuel, buy war bonds, and keep production strong. The artwork was striking, often featuring vivid colors, simple slogans, and dramatic imagery designed to grab attention quickly. For workers and families, these posters became part of the daily landscape, constant reminders that everyone had a role to play. Though simple, they were effective, shaping behavior and strengthening unity. Their designs remain iconic today, preserved in museums and history books. More than propaganda, they were a kind of visual language of the war, speaking directly to the public in a time when every word, every act, and every secret seemed to carry immense weight. Sports continued despite the war. Even in wartime, the love of games endured. Football matches, baseball leagues, and boxing bouts continued, though often with altered rosters as athletes went off to fight. In Britain, makeshift football matches lifted spirits during the Blitz, while in America, baseball was described as vital to morale. President Roosevelt even urged that the game continue, calling it a welcome distraction. Soldiers played wherever they could, on fields between barracks, aboard ships, or even in prisoner of war camps. Equipment was scarce, so games were improvised with whatever was available. Sports offered normalcy, camaraderie, and moments of joy in a world of uncertainty. They reminded participants and spectators alike that life's rhythms continued, that competition and play had a place even in shadowed times. After the war, many athletes returned from service, carrying with them both the memories of battlefields and the resilience learned on fields of sport. Hollywood actors joined the military. The glamour of the silver screen did not keep actors from donning uniforms. Stars like James Stewart, Clark Gable, and Tyrone Power served in the armed forces, trading film sets for cockpits, ships, and battlefields. Stewart flew bombing missions over Europe, Gable served with the Army Air Forces, and Power flew cargo planes in dangerous theaters. Their service inspired fans, proving that fame did not exempt one from duty. Others supported the war through entertainment, with figures like Bob Hope traveling to perform for troops around the world. For soldiers far from home, seeing familiar faces boosted morale, bridging the gap between Hollywood and the hardships of war. The participation of actors gave the conflict a strangely personal dimension, reminding audiences that even those who seemed larger than life were willing to share in sacrifice. It showed that the war touched every life, from farms to studios. Many countries redrew their borders after the war. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the map of the world looked very different. Germany lost territory, and Poland's borders shifted westward. The Soviet Union absorbed lands in the east, while countries across Eastern Europe fell under its influence. In Asia, colonies once held by European empires began their own struggles for independence. These changes were not just lines on a map, but profound upheavals for millions of people who suddenly found themselves living in a different nation without ever leaving home. Families were divided, languages shifted, and new governments rose in the place of old ones. The post-war redrawing of borders reshaped cultures and identities for generations. It was a reminder that war does not end only with treaties. It lingers in the altered landscapes of human life, in the maps children learn, and in the homes left behind forever. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe. After the devastation of the war, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were bombed out, industries destroyed, and millions left homeless. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, an ambitious program of economic aid to help rebuild shattered nations. Billions of dollars flowed across the Atlantic, funding new factories, railways, and housing. The plan also sought to prevent the spread of communism by fostering stability through prosperity. For ordinary Europeans, it meant bread on the table, jobs in the factories, and the slow return of normal life. Streets once filled with rubble began to echo with construction, and hope replaced despair. The Marshall Plan is remembered as one of the most generous acts of post-war policy, shaping not only economies but also alliances. It showed that even after destruction, cooperation and aid could help heal a continent broken by years of war. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation. Defeated and exhausted, Germany was carved into 4 zones of occupation in 1945. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each controlled a section, with Berlin itself divided despite lying deep within Soviet territory. At first, the arrangement was meant to be temporary, a way to manage reconstruction and demilitarization. But tensions soon grew between the Allies, and the division hardened. The Western zones eventually merged into West Germany, while the Soviet-controlled zone became East Germany. Berlin, split by walls and barbed wire, became the very symbol of the Cold War. For Germans, the division shaped everyday life, separating families and creating two very different societies. What began as a practical arrangement became a frontier between rival ideologies, a scar left on the heart of Europe. The partition of Germany showed that while the war had ended, a new conflict was already beginning. Japan was rebuilt under Allied supervision. After surrendering in 1945, Japan came under Allied occupation, led primarily by American General Douglas MacArthur. The task was monumental, rebuilding a nation devastated by bombings, hunger, and loss, while reshaping its political system. New reforms introduced democracy, granting rights and freedoms long denied. Land was redistributed, industries revived, and education modernized. At the same time, Japan renounced war, adopting a constitution that forbade maintaining an aggressive military. Despite the hardships, the rebuilding process set the stage for Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. Within a generation, the country would emerge as one of the world's leading economies, a symbol of resilience and renewal. For the Japanese people, the years of occupation were both difficult and transformative, blending sorrow with hope. Their experience remains one of history's most striking examples of how a nation can rise again from the ashes of destruction. War crimes trials were held at Nuremberg and Tokyo. In the aftermath of war, the world saw justice. At Nuremberg in Germany, leading Nazi officials were tried for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. The proceedings, beginning in 1945, were unprecedented, holding leaders accountable not just for acts of war, but for atrocities committed against civilians. Similar trials took place in Tokyo, where Japanese leaders faced judgment for their roles in the conflict. These tribunals exposed the full horrors of the Holocaust, massacres, and other crimes, placing them into the permanent record of history. Not all perpetrators were tried, but the principle was established. Individuals, even heads of state, could be held responsible under international law. The trials were somber and often harrowing, but they marked a turning point in human justice. They stood as a promise that the world would remember and that such crimes would not pass in silence. Millions of veterans returned to civilian life. When the war ended, millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen returned home. For some, it was a joyous reunion with families after years apart. For others, it was a difficult transition, as the experiences of combat left invisible scars. Governments offered assistance. In the United States, the GI Bill provided education and housing, helping veterans rebuild their futures. In Britain and elsewhere, similar programs aimed to reintegrate those who had served. Yet the challenges were immense: finding work, coping with memories of battle, and adjusting to a world that had changed in their absence. Entire generations carried the weight of their service, shaping societies with their resilience and their need for healing. The return of veterans was one of the war's quieter struggles, not fought with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the slow rebuilding of lives interrupted by global conflict. The Cold War began almost immediately after. Even as victory celebrations echoed across the globe in 1945, new tensions were already brewing. Quote, "The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union gave way to suspicion and rivalry. Ideological differences sharpened into open hostility, as both sides sought to shape the post-war world in their image. Germany became the dividing line, with East and West locked in opposition. Nuclear weapons added a new, terrifying dimension to the rivalry. Though the Cold War was fought mostly through politics, propaganda, and proxy conflicts, its roots lay firmly in the ashes of World War II. For decades, the shadow of superpower tension loomed over the world, shaping alliances, conflicts, and culture. The Cold War reminds us that the end of one great struggle often marks the beginning of another, as humanity moves uneasily from one chapter of history into the next. The atomic age reshaped global politics. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 ended the war in the Pacific, but opened a new era of uncertainty. The world had seen the destructive power of nuclear weapons, and nothing would be the same again. Nations raced to develop their own arsenals, and diplomacy shifted around the terrifying possibility of mutual annihilation. The atomic age reshaped not only politics but also science and culture as people grappled with the promise of nuclear energy and the peril of nuclear war. For many, the image of a mushroom cloud became the defining symbol of modern fear. Yet the dawn of the atomic age also spurred movements for peace, disarmament, and international cooperation. It was a reminder of humanity's ability to create immense power and of the responsibility to use it wisely, lest destruction eclipse hope once again. The memory of the war lives in countless memorials. Across the world, memorials stand in quiet testimony to the millions who suffered and died during the war. From the cemeteries of Normandy to the cenotaphs in small towns, each monument carries names, dates, and stories. In Berlin, Hiroshima, and Warsaw, memorials remind us not only of soldiers but also of civilians and entire communities lost. Simple crosses, eternal flames, and solemn statues speak silently to those who pause before them. These places invite reflection, grief, and gratitude. For veterans and families, they became sites of pilgrimage, while for later generations, they are lessons carved in stone. The memory of the war is not confined to books or classrooms, but inscribed on the very landscapes of our world. Each memorial whispers the same truth, that remembrance is not just for the past, but for the future, ensuring that such devastation is never repeated. World War II still shapes the modern world today. Though more than 7 decades have passed, the Second World War continues to shape our world. Nations born from its aftermath, alliances forged in its fires, and lessons drawn from its tragedies still guide politics, culture, and memory. Technology developed during the war, from jet engines to computers, laid the foundation for modern life. The United Nations, created to prevent future conflicts, remains central to international dialogue. Families across the globe still trace their stories back to those turbulent years, through the bravery of ancestors, the loss of loved ones, or the displacement of entire communities. Museums, films, and books keep the memory alive, ensuring that the world does not forget. To study World War II is to study ourselves, our capacity for destruction, but also for resilience and renewal. Its legacy endures not as distant history, but as a living thread woven into the present. And so, our long journey through the echoes of World War II comes to a close. We have walked through ruined cities and quiet countrysides, crossed oceans filled with convoys, and listened to voices carried on radios and letters that bridged entire worlds. We have seen sorrow, resilience, invention, and hope, the countless threads that wove together into the tapestry of the most immense conflict in human history. Now, the battles are long past. The planes and ships are gone, and the guns have fallen silent. What remains are memories, etched in diaries, memorials, and the lives of those who came after. To reflect on them is not to dwell in darkness, but to honor endurance, to marvel at humanity's ability to rebuild, and to let gratitude soften the weight of history. As you drift into sleep, let the noise of war fade into silence. Picture instead the rebuilding, streets filling with laughter once more, children planting gardens where rubble once lay, and families reunited beneath skies no longer torn by searchlights. The war, though vast and heavy, becomes now only a distant murmur, fading into the background of your dreams. Thank you for joining me tonight on the Sleepy History Channel. If you found comfort in this quiet journey through time, you might consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your favorite fact in the comments below. And when you're ready, the next video awaits, another soft path through the mysteries of the past. But for now, close your eyes. Let the long story of the world slip gently away and rest in the peace of the present moment. Good night.